I'm here with Briahna Gray. She is a former and now once again current affairs contributing editor. She is also a former politics editor for The Intercept, but most recently she has spent the entirety of the Bernie Sanders campaign as the press secretary of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I am talking to her because first I want to welcome her back to Current Affairs after a long absence in which we have missed her terribly.
Thank you, Nathan J. Robinson. I missed you guys all so very much. I mean it when I say that I'm so happy to be able to work with the smartest and kindest people I know. It's truly, truly true. You guys are
They're good.
Big, bleeding, beautiful hearts, and I love each and every one of you.
Well, we've had so much fun together. The Current Affairs live show last January, which was a fantastic success in Washington D.C.
Feels like it was a million years ago.
To take, I think, the opportunity of a lifetime in some ways, because as I understand it, it's been quite an experience.
It has been. I mean, I still reflect on the fact that I couldn't believe that anybody was ever going to allow me to kind of write my opinion for a living. I thought that was something that was well beyond what I would ever be able to achieve. And when a career in journalism presented itself after those first few freelance pieces that you were so gracious to publish in Current Affairs took off, I had already peaked in my mind and achieved my wildest dreams. And then for the Bernie campaign to come along and think that I was at all qualified and well positioned to do that job and to put that faith in me was an enormously humbling experience that I will always treasure. And it was a true honor to be able to serve Bernie Sanders for this past year.
Well, you and I are both big Bernie fans, and I mean, that was a thing that was really going to be impossible to turn down. But I do kind of want to ask you, like, you had not worked on the staff of a political campaign before, as I take it. So this is a real learning experience. You get also, for all the questions that are being asked about, why did Bernie lose? The fact is that objectively speaking, it was an underdog campaign to begin with. So you're really, you're faced with trying to make someone win where their victory would be completely unprecedented in American politics, and they're presenting a message to voters that is almost never heard. And your job as the press secretary is to make that message heard and to think about how to use a media that is completely hostile to you. So you get there on day one. How does that work?
So for one, I didn't have the relative experience of what it was like to work on a more prototypical campaign. And so I both had to learn what a normal press agent's job was, and then also how to adapt it for this new context in which, I'm wary sometimes about talking so much about how biased the media is and the corporate media and the mainstream media, even though it's entirely true, because I know that we start to sound like nutters at a certain point. But, the reality is you can see myriad examples of how differently Bernie Sanders was treated. So the question becomes, are we able to bring up issues about other candidates and have them treated fairly, as opposed to them being covered as Bernie Sanders going on the attack, or Bernie Sanders being unnecessarily aggressive or simply pointing out a policy contrast? Can you get people to cover the policies that Bernie is putting out fairly, and noticing the details and the differences between his policies and other people's versions of the policies, without them being collapsed in a way that is beneficial to more moderate policies that don't adequately accommodate the needs of working class voters? Can you get the media to cover issues that pertain to working class voters, as opposed to the interests more often reflected by people in the professional managerial class who tend to hold positions at elite media institutions? Are there stunts that you can perform that will kind of force their hand and draw their attention? Can you use your own in-house media in a way that forces different kinds of conversation, and forces people to pay attention in a way that you might not get, or if you're not getting the same kind of access to the mainstream news? So those are all things we have to wrestle with.
Let me ask you about to go into a little more specifically what we mean when we say I mean, I am the same as you. I talk a lot about, especially after this election where it seems like the influence of the mainstream media was incredibly, incredibly important, right? Bernie raised the most money. He had by far the most organized campaign on the ground. But one of the big lessons is that it's really, really hard to compete with the sort of giant, well-funded noise machine that funnels information into millions of people's brains. But when we talk about, as I say, you don't want to sound crazy. You don't want to say like the media, that's the damn media's fault. So what specific, when you're talking about a media that is hostile to Bernie and his ideas, how does that manifest itself specifically? What does that mean in terms of what people are going to see? When we talk about bias, what are we really talking about concretely?
Yeah, I mean, so people have written about this idea that there's a way that journalism is perceived sometimes currently that says there's two sides to everything, and that balance requires covering both sides equally, which, obscures instances when there are in fact facts, like climate change is real, the sun rises in the east, that you don't need to have two experts to kind of opine on in equal measure. And similarly, when you're talking about policy, there was some objective truths about what our policies would and would not do, how much they were possible versus not, and how much other candidates' policies were able to offer along the same metrics. And so you got unending conversations, for example, about how will we pay for it, and this idea that if you like your healthcare, you can keep it, which never once was challenged by anybody in the media elite, even once. And now we're in the middle of a global pandemic where we have historic unemployment rates. And to this moment, Pete Buttigieg is going on The View and going on, mainstream media news outlets. And not once has he been asked, have you revised your opinion that an employer-based healthcare model protects the interests of Americans sufficiently? Do you think that it is responsible for you to have characterized an employer-based healthcare system as to somehow a guarantee of healthcare choice when in fact it is completely contingent on jobs, which have, to be clear, for many communities like African Americans, have always been unemployment has always been significantly higher than it has for the rest of the population for myriad historical reasons and discriminatory reasons. So that's just one example, and we all saw myriad banners, chyrons that were misrepresentative. We saw an entire cycle this summer where Bernie Sanders, when he was moved into second place, was just left out of all accounts, and you would see stories about another candidate moving into third and so being in first, and just the second place person
fourth,
being out
but
of there.
a strong fourth.
A strong fourth. Yeah, you saw Bernie Sanders being omitted wholesale from articles about events that all of the candidates attended. You saw concern trolling about Bernie's support among African Americans when consistently throughout the race he was either first or second with African American voters.
Concern trolling being when someone suggests that they're very deeply concerned and just want to help you, but really they want to undermine you. And I feel like you saw a lot. There were so many articles by like Republican strategists going, I care so much about how the Democrats do, and they just won't do well with this socialism stuff. So if they care about their own interests, I, as a Republican, am just generously offering to help them.
Right. At this point, some of the most trusted advisors, both online and on television, to the Democratic Party are, in fact, Republicans. Jennifer Rubin and Nicole Wallace, and a lot of, newscasters, not to, besmirch them, but the reality is that they are, in fact, conservatives. And it's really frustrating sometimes to see online that so-called resistance liberals who purport to share the same values that I do as a progressive will line up behind the opinions of those people before they will, listen in good faith to the critiques from the left. So you're right. It's concern trolling. It's not to say that it doesn't matter how much African American support there is. It doesn't matter that Bernie Sanders and a number of other candidates could have improved with Black outreach, but I just don't trust that you are sincerely levying that criticism when you're the New York Times saying Bernie Sanders has a Black problem, and then on the other hand endorsing two white female candidates who combined don't capture more than 10% of the Black vote. Right?
Yeah, I mean, right. Everyone talked about Bernie Sanders' Black, which, it's true that Bernie Sanders did not make sufficient inroads among African-American voters, but, Pete Buttigieg's Black problem was, a million times worse, and no one talked about the strength of the Bernie campaign this time among Latino voters, which was,
right.
It was huge, actually, and one of the reasons behind his blowout victory in Nevada, and something that nobody else talked about, the Latino
right.
problem of every other candidate.
And to not move off the Black point as well, I want to say that if we're going to talk about Black voter problems, it wasn't just Buttigieg and Klobuchar and people like that who struggled to get above 1%. The Black candidates in this race struggled to get above 4-ish% of the Black vote.
Cory Booker's Black problem we could have talked about. But.
Exactly. I mean, there was an article shortly before I left The Intercept that pointed out that Black voters preferred Bernie 2-1 to Kamala Harris. The reality is that Elizabeth Warren had a hard time getting above 9% with Black voters, and I haven't heard once anybody critique her inability to reach out to Black voters and working class voters who overwhelmingly chose Bernie Sanders as their progressive champion. So, and to your point about Latino voters, it became very clear that there's not a genuine interest in what voters of color think or what their preferences are, beyond their ability to advance the political interests of the professional managerial class. So, as you pointed out, Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly won the Latino vote. He won 70% of the Latino vote in Nevada, the first diverse state to run. And it was treated as though, I believe it was, that we were brown shirts and that we needed to be concerned that Nazis were going to riot in the street and cut off Chris Matthews' head. That was the kind of news coverage we got after winning the most diverse state that had voted so far with the first potentially Jewish candidate for the Democratic Party. So, you could, Latino vote is strategically important also in ways that the Black vote isn't necessarily in a general election. We saw this in 2016. The states where African Americans are concentrated in the Southeast tend to not go blue regardless, whereas the Southwest is this new Midwest, is this logic. So your ability to hold down states like Arizona and New Mexico can be a real boon. In Texas, it would be a real boon to anyone in a general election. And it's a concern of a lot of people now, whether or not Joe Biden is going to be able to get the same fidelity and trust that Bernie Sanders, with his immigrant story and his amazing immigration policy, was able to engender among Latino voters.
Well, I do want to ask you, because I think this is all completely true about the way that there is a double standard applied, and that the same critiques that are made of Bernie Sanders are not made of other candidates when they have the same problems, and the way it's treated as a failure when the left gets like 40% of the vote to the center getting 60%, where actually like a few years ago we would have gotten 5% of the vote, and really the fact that like a socialist is now getting 40% of the vote in a conservative state is really like a mark that something's happening. But at the same time, Joe Biden's South Carolina victory is very, very real. It is true that Bernie lost in overwhelming numbers in many of these southern states, amongst Southern Black voters especially. Looking back now after the campaign, what is your honest? I mean, this happened in 2016 as well. It is something that needs to be thought about critically and constructively if the left is going to build serious political power all around the country. What is your kind of honest explanation for why that happened?
I think it is absolutely true. And again, this is someone who, I was not in the room. There are a lot of high-level decisions that were made that I was not privy to. And so I don't want to, be a Monday morning quarterback when there might have been all kinds of constraints that are legitimate that I'm just not aware of. But from where I'm sitting, of course, there could have been earlier investment and more investment in those states. I think that we needed to push an electability narrative more. I think that there were moments where folks thought, okay, we need to get these Black voters, so let's do a push about criminal justice, or, we ran a Dolly Myers ad, an ad about a local elected official in South Carolina who flipped from being a Biden supporter to a Bernie supporter, which is kind of tacitly an electability argument. But what we saw in poll after poll is that those voters didn't vote for Joe Biden because they preferred him on a policy basis, or even preferred him, or even found him more likable. They just bought the argument, again, pushed hard by the mainstream media, that he was the most electable on the basis of I'm not exactly sure what. But there was a lot of socialism hand-wringing, scaring from the media, and we could have done more to push back against that. But I think the bigger challenge for the left is that there are some structural and institutional reasons why Southern voters and Southern politicians experience a greater degree of corporate capture, right? So we've all read a lot of the coverage coming out of The Intercept about how elected officials, Congress members are required to raise certain amounts of money, are required to give to Democratic National Committees, are required to do a lot of fundraising. And as a consequence, if you are an African-American elected official who's disproportionately likely to be coming from an African-American district, which is for historical reasons likely to be lower income, you are not able to make calls to your constituents and raise as much money as people who live in more affluent districts. So there is this kind of perverse reality that a lot of our representatives are more subject to corporate capture than members of other communities. And it's not because of they're bad people or it's their fault. It's completely structural. And there is a long tradition, additionally, of the Democratic Party being a meaningful presence in the South and the last bulwark for these communities against outward racist, Republican, or in a different era, Dixiecrat, assaults on people's freedom and liberty. So, there's a lot of real cultural history there. There's a lot of legitimate fidelity there. And there's also this issue of, for lack of a better word, influence peddling that is difficult to break. And it's going to take, I think, a generational shift and a lot of long-term community investments that people realize that they can trust the left and trust these politicians without us coming off as carpetbaggers.
Does that partly explain why you saw so many black mayors endorsing Michael Bloomberg unexpectedly? Because when that started happening and there were all these, people like, I liked Michael Tubbs of Stockton, and then I saw him come out for Bloomberg. But the first thing that I thought was not, Michael Tubbs is suddenly a sellout. It was rather like, when you're the mayor of a city that doesn't have much in the way of financial resources, and a billionaire comes along to you and says, I will literally invest in your city, I will give huge grants to your city, and all I'm asking in return is that you say a few favorable things about me. It's almost like a devil's bargain that is very, very difficult, even for a well-intentioned politician, to turn down.
And that is such an important point, because, and I tried to get at this in an interview I did with Jon Favreau on the campaign podcast Hear the Burn. There is a way that sometimes liberals can perceive politics as good guys versus bad guys. And if you like Obama and you think he's a nice guy, like so many of us do, he seems like a fun person, an interesting person, a smart person, a family man, then the question becomes, well, if he just does something I disagree with, it must be because his hand was forced and this was just the best choice and it is what it is. And I don't mean to make an example of him, but I just pick him because he's so well liked and held in high esteem. But the reality is that good people end up doing bad things and making bad decisions all the time because of the way that power structures exist. And I think that the difference between the left and the center left in a lot of ways is how we perceive power as operating and how to extract good outcomes. And that's why we see the influence of money in politics as so central to our argument, and why we focus so much on corruption, and why we focus so much on a wealth tax, not just as a redistributive mechanism, but as a way to curb the anti-democratic effects of having large concentrations of wealth at the top.
Well, yeah, I think, when we talk about power on the left, again, people's first instinct is that we sound like conspiracy theorists, but it's actually quite simple in the way that it operates. And when I wrote about Michael Bloomberg and looked through his record as mayor of New York, power operated in a very straightforward way. So when he wanted to get a third term as mayor, even though there were term limits in place, what he did is he used his philanthropy, all these organizations that he'd given money to, and he had the people that he'd given money to testify that he was to the city council that they should expand term limits. And he was able to do that because he has more money than God. He just has so much. He has like infinite wealth, basically, when you just look at the amount. You know, I'm sure you've seen those charts where they like try and show you how much $1 billion really is.
Right.
And it's just absurd. Now, he wasn't ultimately able to buy this election, which shows that you can defeat. Money isn't like an absolute force that overrides everything else. But the fact that a billionaire Republican with no record that any Democratic voter should want to support can come into the race and just by spending so much, like just, again, infinite amounts of money, could get like 18% of the vote automatically. That's an illustration of what we mean when we're talking about the power of wealth.
Precisely. I mean, I saw it firsthand. I think in early February, I was sent down to the Alabama Democratic Party convention. And the Alabama Democratic Party is basically all black. And Bloomberg was hosting it that year, was the keynote speaker and the person who funded the event. And unsurprisingly, about a week later, they endorsed him. But it wasn't as though when I spoke to the people who were attending the event, they had any interest, fidelity to affinity for Michael Bloomberg. They, understood it was what it was. A lot of them said some very sympathetic things to me about how, like, oh yes, when Bloomberg drops out, I'm interested in Bernie, or when Biden drops out, he was probably the next most popular person because Congresswoman Terry Sewell is a Biden delegate, Alabama representative. Even they were like, well, when Biden drops out, we like Bernie. We don't think that he's going to last either. And so, one of the most frustrating aspects of 2016 was that it did feel like there were a lot of people who liked Bernie, but wouldn't back him because they just didn't feel like he could do it. And everybody voting on the basis of what everyone else thought was going to happen. And I think a lot of black voters also thought, well, let me vote on who I think white people will back in general. Let me vote on who I think moderates, independents will back. And if you have the media never explaining to anybody that in fact Bernie Sanders is number one with independents, that he's number one in turning out voters who don't typically come to the polls, which is exactly what you need to vote for Trump, then you're never going to overcome this electability false narrative. And of course, there are things that the campaign could have done better to push back against that electability narrative. I think everybody agrees that we should have focused more on that from the beginning.
Well, yeah, there's this self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of it where everyone thinks that Bernie is unelectable, therefore he becomes unelectable, right? But you all agree, oh, I would like to vote for him. Well, you go, well, if you just voted the way that you say, that if everyone just did what it was in their heart, we'd win. Instead of trying to make calculations as to what other people are going to do. I think in some ways, well, I think you're stuck, right? Because it seems to me like I almost fell into the trap of emphasizing policy a lot, right?
Yeah.
Here are all the good things that we want to do. And I think actually that Jeremy Corbyn suffered a little bit from this too, because they focused in the 2019 election on all of their policies. They had tons of fantastic policies. Personally, I sort of almost blamed Elizabeth Warren for starting a policy arms race where everyone had to be as specific as possible about their policies. And so you end up having these debates about all the stuff we're going to do, which is really important. But because on the left, we're very sensitive to that criticism that says, oh, you have big plans, but we need more specifics. we end up talking a lot about the plans. And then, as you say, we get away from the real argument, which is, well, who can beat Trump? And then someone else who hasn't talked about plans at all, and whose plans, I'm talking about Joe Biden, right, whose plans are garbage, or who just like copy-pasted them from Wikipedia, like that person then comes along and goes, forget policies. You don't care about policies. You care about winning, because policies mean nothing without winning. And you're like, but you were just saying that the left couldn't win because we didn't have all the specific policies. And we're trying to... But to me, the pragmatic argument that we on the left have always made is frustrating, because I go back to 2016, and the thing that we were arguing about Bernie was the whole reason you need Bernie is electability, because he's the way you beat Trump. And the whole reason that Hillary Clinton failed is because she wasn't electable, and that's why Bernie would have won.
Yeah, I agree with that to some extent, although I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. I actually think that although there was the policy arms race, by the time we got to 2020, and especially by the time we started to vote and it became clear that the enthusiasm for Elizabeth Warren in the media didn't translate into the voter booth, that the policy arms race had come to a detente. And I think to our benefit, the conversation still squarely revolved around the big ticket items of Medicare for all and student debt cancellation for the most part. And so when you had the debates, it wasn't like we were getting mired down in the details of what Bernie Sanders' Workplace Democracy Act was about, or, I mean, frankly, even climate, the Green New Deal didn't come up that much, even though it should have come up more. Immigration was discussed, but that's something that always comes up, not so much as a policy, particularized policy debate, but just as a general issue that gets hit in these debates. So I don't actually think that that was the issue as much. I do think the campaign should have stressed its big ticket items more. I would go to a college campus and it would frustrate me that every kid there didn't know that Bernie Sanders was the only candidate with the plan to cancel all student debt. I felt like we could have had posters with that simple message going up on every college campus, a digital card with that simple message being hashtagged to every conceivable hashtag that there was, having our student organizers who did such amazing work on all these campuses tasked with pressing that singular message out in a way that would have more traction than dividing attention. But I also think that you could say, let's pick three things: do student debt cancellation, Medicare for all, maybe also medical debt cancellation, and electability. I think that there was enough room for all of those things, because if you think about Joe Biden, it's not as though he was on stage making some compelling electability narrative that he had space to make because he wasn't talking about policy. The thing I do think we needed to think more about critically was putting those people who didn't support our policies on the defensive, so that they had to answer for why they supported a system, for instance, that would enable poor people to die because they didn't have health insurance. And if you don't have media figures, if you don't have people asking questions at the debate, ever asking moderates, or I don't want to call them moderates because that sounds, Bernie Sanders is the real moderate. If they're not going to ask the corporate Democrats to explain why they're willing to let 68,000 people die every year because they don't have health insurance, then it becomes incumbent on Bernie Sanders to be the one asking those questions, which is difficult when you're a candidate like Bernie, who we've all seen is reluctant to be as aggressive as some people in the movement would have wanted him to be.
Well, yeah, so it's an interesting thing about media bias that it doesn't necessarily even mean not talking about the right topics. It's often not asking the right questions. Like, a huge portion of nearly every debate was devoted to debating Medicare for all, it seemed.
Yeah.
Right? But it was the how are you going to pay for it question. And these unasked questions, I think if you went through, and it'd be interesting to compile all the questions that were asked at all the debates, which were often of the like, how much do you love our troops variety.
Yeah. I'd read that article, Nathan.
Huh?
I'd read that article, Nathan.
Yeah, I should do that. I should just go through and, would you kill an Iranian general? Would you? Or do you want Americans to die? Right, it was all that kind of stuff. But with Medicare for all, right, there, as you say, there is this how we face this how are you going to pay for it challenge, and this like, why would you throw people off their insurance? This was the most frustrating debate of this election cycle to me, was why are you going to throw all these people off their insurance when there is no throwing people off their insurance. People are
Yeah.
still insured the day after they get onto Medicare for All, like they were before. It's a change in the financing structure. And the people who support the employer-based healthcare are throwing people off their insurance all the time because they're losing their jobs, and now millions of people are getting thrown off their insurance. But Pete Buttigieg, as you say, is never asked, why do you want to throw so many people off their insurance?
Right. Or Pete Buttigieg, if we're going to be talking about the particulars of people's plans, Pete Buttigieg should have to explain why his plan requires people to pay a $7,000 tax at the end of the year if they don't subscribe to his healthcare plan, right? Joe Biden should have to explain why his plan leaves 10 million Americans uninsured. Those are very simple questions with very obvious moral penalties to them, which are, again, it's unfortunate that Bernie's in a position that he has to be the one to levy the question because the media isn't doing its job. But at the end of the day, it's incumbent on the campaign to be able to reframe the debate in that direction. And I think that we could have done a better job, both with the principal and with the surrogates.
You know, I think you and I both hesitate to say critical things about Bernie Sanders because both of us understand that, like, Jesus, of all the people in the US who have, like, worked hard to make other people's lives better, this old man who, like, nearly died trying to get us healthcare, what, we're gonna go and we're gonna, like, shit on him and go, like, well, your messaging could have been better, right? It's like, but also, I think you and I both agree that the criticism of him that he's too divisive and attacks the Democratic establishment too much is the opposite of the truth, because the real criticism of Bernie Sanders that I think you and I probably can be honest about right now is he's too fucking nice. Like, he's just like, you know, this My Friend Joe, right, where, like, you know, Alexander Coburn has that famous quote where he says he always asks leftists, is your hate pure? And if your hate isn't pure, he's like, then there's a problem. But I feel like, you know, I watched Bernie Sanders never say a negative word about, for example, Elizabeth Warren. And to me, one of the central problems, the things that were causing huge problems for getting every progressive on board with Bernie's campaign was that we had not laid out well enough the case for why Elizabeth Warren was inadequate and why there was a huge difference between her kind of politics and his. And when Bernie was asked about that, he would say things like, well, you know, I'm a socialist, she's a capitalist. But to ordinary people, that doesn't necessarily translate into much unless you're going like, look, she has a long record of, like, defending corporations and then lying about, like, that's a huge fact to just set aside for the sake of politeness. And the same with Joe Biden, like, you know, to set aside a lot of the stuff that's really, really terrible out of politeness.
Yeah, it's difficult, especially earlier in the race. I was a proponent of making more distinctions with Elizabeth Warren, but I'm also sensitive to the fact that, especially in a crowded race, doing some things that are perceived as attacks tends to rebound negatively on the person making the attack. You saw this with Kamala Harris. You saw this with Julian Castro. You know, and I do think that ultimately Elizabeth Warren was kind of hoisted by her own petard, so it wasn't really an issue in the end, except for that when it became clear that she wasn't viable, you know, she made the choice not to drop out before Super Tuesday, and people can think what they want about what she owes us, et cetera. But I think it's pretty undeniable that that had a significant impact in creating a narrative about Bernie Sanders that he was never able to recover from. But I do think that there were some ways in which we could have drawn clear distinctions that it would have been hard for the media to frame as a hit and a sexist hit, right? Because that's another shade here, that anything that needed to be said about Elizabeth Warren was going to be framed a certain way, especially if it was from an angry, hand-waving Jewish man like Bernie Sanders, right? But I do think the fact that I think it's fair game to say Elizabeth Warren does not have a plan to cancel all student debt. She just doesn't. She has a means-tested program, and if you're one of the hundreds of thousands of Americans like myself who have hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt, who would not be helped by Elizabeth Warren's plan, it's worth saying out loud. It's worth saying that Elizabeth Warren did not have a plan to cancel medical debt, even though she decided to get into politics and became a Democrat after being a lifelong Republican, in part because of her understanding of how medical bankruptcy drove bankruptcies in America. It only cost $81 billion to cancel medical debt. She was willing to vote for an $82 billion increase to Trump's military budget. Why doesn't she have a plan to cancel $81 billion in medical debt? I think these are fair claims. And I think that even if you get some pushback on them, it's pushback that's worth weathering, especially if you can put a female spokesperson out there to try to articulate these issues. So yeah, it's hard to Monday morning quarterback. I think ultimately that's not what Elizabeth Warren's policies and distinguishing ourselves from her wasn't ultimately the problem. Although if she had dropped out a lot earlier, it would have made a difference. And I think hitting Joe Biden a lot earlier. You know, a lot of this Me Too stuff that's now percolating started before he even entered the race. And if you think back to last March, there was a moment where it wasn't clear that he was going to enter. And I think that if the reporters who were investigating these stories had been more thorough, I think that, you know, I don't know if you listened to the Daily a couple days ago, but they had one of the New York Times reporters who covered the story on, who said, yeah, I interviewed Tara Reid back then. And when I look back at my notes, I think there were holes there that I should have investigated more thoroughly. And imagine what our world would look like if they had done their job, and we wouldn't be forced into this position where we have a choice between two men who have both been credibly accused of sexual assault. So
yeah, and by holes, she does not mean that Tara Reid wasn't credible. She means that she thought there was more to the story.
Yes.
That she didn't look into. Yeah, I want to talk to you about Joe Biden, because I feel like, well, you have been say outspoken in recent days in critiquing Joe Biden, but I don't think there is much of a difference between you and Bernie at this point on the goal, but certainly in tone, you have been different, because as he has endorsed and sort of rallied around Joe Biden, you've taken the position that we need to keep criticizing and critiquing and calling out Biden for things that he's done. I feel as if now we're in this incredibly frustrating and difficult position where none of us want Donald Trump to be reelected. It's such a nightmare. We obviously understand the human toll of his presidency. We understand that 4 more years will be a catastrophe for the climate, for immigrants, for democracy more broadly. And yet, we have now gotten to the point where the Democrats have picked probably one of the worst of the available nominees. I mean, even like Cory Booker, Julio Castro, Kamala Harris. I wish we had one of them. Instead, we have a guy who spent decades as one of the most conservative Democrats, who was picked by Obama precisely because he was a conservative Democrat who could appease racist white people. And now we're stuck. And of course, who has been credibly accused of sexual assault and a string of acts of physical misconduct against women. Just all things that as progressives we loathe and that are counter to our values. And we face this impossible choice between, like, well, do you silence yourself, or do you let people go, oh, well, by criticizing Biden, now you want to elect Trump? And you and I are struggling with this at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, look, the response by some people to my tweet that I don't endorse Biden has been that I am tacitly endorsing Trump, that I am, in fact, a Trumper, that I don't care what happens in the general election, which is obviously silly and arguments made in bad faith. The reality is that I see two potentialities. There's a very narrow prospect of the Democratic Party choosing to substitute somebody who is not Joe Biden in as the nominee. It's unlikely. It would be politically difficult. It would have to be done with Biden's complicity, so it's unclear where he is. But we're in a very uncertain time with the pandemic. I don't want to peddle, rumors and mythologies about what's going on. I'm not qualified to comment on Biden's health or cognitive status or anything like that. But the reality is there's things that are up in the air. And I think a lot of people, Democrats, more, centrist Democrats, are also worried about his electability. And so my goal is to make him more electable, either by making the case for why, if they're planning to substitute someone in, they should substitute someone in who better accommodates the values of most Americans, or how Biden himself can make himself a candidate that is more electable by offering something sufficiently positive that people can overlook some seriously negative aspects of his campaign and potentially his character, depending on how these sexual assault claims are vetted. So what I see myself as doing is helping helping in the effort to get Trump out of office by making sure that the person who goes up against Trump has been fully vetted and is prepared to withstand critiques that are going to be far more aggressive and far more visceral than anything that I'm mildly tweeting on the internet.
Well, I've talked about the Tara Reade allegation a lot. And yeah. I and then of course I get all the replies that say, well, Donald Trump did, our guy is the lesser of the two sexual assailants. Yeah. But I consider myself to be trying to help, because it's before we've actually formally nominated this guy, we need to discuss this, because it doesn't become less real through you not talking about it. Yeah. And to me, I'm firmly convinced, after talking extensively to Tara Reade and to talking to her two witnesses, actually the three witnesses, I've talked to two of them, that there's no good reason to believe this woman is not telling the truth, and she is going to say quite loudly, please don't vote for the man who assaulted me, which is a pretty persuasive argument, because we have values, and giving someone the most trusted office in the country, who is someone who abused a staffer, is kind of unconscionable. So how are we not going to talk about that?
Yeah, if there's blame to be laid, it's certainly not at leftists, at centrists, at Republicans, at anybody in this country who is disturbed by these allegations that have now come to light. The onus lies on those people in the media who were aware of these allegations prior to Bernie Sanders dropping out of the race, and who, it seems for pretty nakedly political reasons, chose to hold reporting on this issue until after Biden became the presumptive nominee. So you can't bury a story for a couple of weeks. You can't ignore Ryan Grimm's reporting when you were very excited, enthusiastic about his Kavanaugh reporting, breaking that story, and then the New York Times reported it 2 days later. By contrast, when this story was broken by Ryan, they took 2.5 weeks to write something conveniently, I think about 3 days after Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race. I'm not the one that's, the left isn't the one that's politicizing this issue. When Joe Biden's campaign, it's now been reported, can call and get the New York Times to change a very inculpatory line from saying...
literally. That's literally what happened.
Yeah, the line which originally read, there has been no pattern of behavior of abuse from Joe Biden except for all these instances of abuse.
For the pattern of behavior.
Right. Which then they cut off the second part of the line and then don't even note the correction. It's disturbing.
Yeah.
And when you listen to, I don't know if you listened to the Pod Save America interview with Amanda Marcotte,
I couldn't.
who wrote one of the earlier accounts in Jezebel. It's even if you're not someone who is willing to say, I 100% believe Tara, as an impartial observer, it is reckless to the point that it feels to me like they need to offer an apology, especially given the close relationship between some members of the Pod Save team and Ronan Farrow, who has done such amazing reporting on these issues. It's just, I know that those men, I think that they were a lot fairer than Amanda Marcotte was on the program. But the reality is, having her on was a miscalculation, and airing that interview after they did it was a miscalculation.
I wrote an article debunking everything Marcotte said. I'm waiting for my Pod Save America.
Yeah, they should have you on. They should consider having Katie Halper on.
Have Tara!
They should ask Tara on, and they should ask Joe Biden on. Because Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee.
Joe Biden.
Right. He has been, sequestered away. He hasn't been available to the press. And when he has, nobody's asked him these questions. The women of The View and a number of other women in the media who purport to care a great deal about these issues, and I believe that they do, need to make sure that they don't care in a selective manner.
Well, this is why you should be on The View.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't think that those days are I don't think that kind of joking dream is manifesting anytime soon.
Due to your recent criticisms of Democrats, you've recently been told by a lot of people that you'll never work in Washington again. How do you feel about that?
I'm from New York, and I'm really looking forward to going back home.
I do want to ask you about, separate from the sexual assault, the policy thing, right? Because there's been a lot of, there's also the other half of the criticisms of Biden is, well, he doesn't share our goals in many ways. And people like, for example, Matt Iglesias of Vox have said, well, look at his platform. It's far more progressive than you're giving him credit for. No. It's not fair not to see Joe Biden as way better than Donald Trump on, for example, climate change. So, I mean, it is true, right, though, that Joe Biden is clearly not nearly as bad on climate change as Donald Trump. He may be 10% of what Bernie was, but is it the case that by criticizing Joe Biden too heavily, we collapse the distinction between him and Trump in an unfair way?
If either Joe Biden or Donald Trump is president, we will not meet the emissions standards that the IPCC recommends for us not to meet complete and total planetary disaster in the next now 8 years or however long we have left. That is just a point of fact. So you can say there are a lot of areas where saying, oh, Trump and Biden are the same is silly. And of course, even in this area, it's not true. They aren't the same. There are meaningful differences. But if the ultimate price to pay is that we are not going to pull the planet back from the brink of no return. Mind you that we've already crossed a lot of Rubicons that can't be uncrossed, and we're already facing climate disasters, and you can't really put that genie back into the bottle anyway. But before we cross the next Rubicon, we have an opportunity to draw, to prevent a lot of really grievous harm. We need to be clear-eyed about the fact that there's a reason why, climate groups have given Joe Biden an F- grade. And that's because he doesn't do the bare minimum that anybody who has a D, Democrat, next to their name and says they believe in climate science and climate change needs to do to keep Americans and the whole world safe and freaking alive. And if we're not willing to hold Joe Biden to that very minimalistic standard, then all the people who claim that Bernie's not a Democrat and we're not Democrats and we don't have fidelity to the party, I want to ask them what they are pledging fidelity to, what they're actually fighting for. Because climate change is one of those all or nothing existential issues. And we're not asking a ton. We're asking for Joe Biden to meaningfully commit the way a number of other candidates did. If, Elizabeth Warren endorsed him this morning, commit to her climate policies. I don't need Bernie's name to be on it. This isn't about narcissism or scoring points. This is about me being able to ethically decide to have a child.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think distinguishes often liberals and leftists is that liberals often talk in terms of better and leftists often talk in terms of good. So there's this relative thinking. And this is why you see people like Matt Iglesias and Nicholas Kristof saying sweatshops are good, for instance, because they say, oh, well, sweatshops are slightly better than, farming in developing countries, right? And that makes them good because to them, better is good. So if you're better than Donald Trump, you're good. If you have assaulted fewer people, if you're slightly better, if your climate change plan kills slightly fewer people, that's the same as being good. Whereas leftists have a more kind of absolute standard where we say the lesser of two horrendous catastrophes, it's kind of grotesque to even put those things against each other. To start doing a spreadsheet of assaults and seeing how many are tolerable. Instead, we have a standard does this meet the standard of justice? Right?
Yeah, it's frustrating because one, I think there are electoral consequences to that incrementalist approach. It doesn't get people fired up. It doesn't make people feel like there will be meaningful changes in their lives, especially if you've been told things are going to get better your whole life and you never feel it, because what ends up happening is incremental policies tend to accrue to the benefit of the 1%. You're seeing this right now with the pandemic bailout efforts. The people who are applying for these small business loans, well, I was just talking to my mother about this, who has a small business. The people who are getting preference are folks who already have relationships with the banks. What kind of businesses already have relationships with the banks? People who are already in a more advantageous position economically, right? So on and on down the line. And the other thing is, like, if I'm from a community like my family is from, and I've been told that things are going to get incrementally better, and people keep holding out this idea that, hey, it's not the 1960s anymore, you can go to a lunch counter as somehow what they should be grateful for. I'm sorry, they're not going to take time off of their second shift to go stand in a long line where they're going to catch coronavirus to vote for a candidate who doesn't even care about them enough to protect their lives and their pocketbooks in the midst of a life-threatening pandemic, you know? So I don't think it's about litmus test. I don't think it's that we're being unreasonable. I think that it is an electoral argument, an electability argument to pursue these things. And most importantly, it is a moral argument. And these programs are also more sustainable if they actually can be felt in a more realistic way. The way that Social Security checks can be felt, and it's a hard program to ratchet back.
I'm pro litmus tests if they're reasonable, because I feel like it's a low bar to cross in many ways what we're asking for, right? The last thing I just wanted to ask you is about lessons for the future, prospective. You've now been through a campaign that did very well at one point. Bernie Sanders was, I mean, it's kind of painful to look back on, was like favored to win nearly every state in the post-Nevada moment, and then it sort of reversed very quickly, and Joe Biden consolidated the centrist candidates behind him. Not just electorally, but, you know, and then the entire country fell apart with coronavirus very quickly. So we're now in this real uncertain moment for the left, where we're like, on the one hand, it seems like a lot of our points have been proven about, like, why you need to not have healthcare tied to employment, for instance, and, you know, why you need a basic social safety net that cares about people. On the other hand, you know, the thing that people just invested a lot of their hopes and aspirations in, the Bernie Sanders campaign, has now ended, and we are now being asked to endorse a candidate who inspires very few of us. And we don't really know where we go from here. I know that you personally don't really know where you're going from here yet, and still trying to figure out what your next employment will be. You're on the masthead of current affairs, but unfortunately this is a part-time nominal position rather than a full-time well-paying position. So, you know, yeah, do you have any thoughts right now about where the left goes from here and things you've learned from this campaign about what we need to do next time?
Yeah, I don't want to, you know, some people on the internet have been kind of, you know, kind of putting me kind of presumptively in this kind of leadership position, which I don't rebuke, but I want to make sure, I think whatever we do next, it should be a very collaborative conversation between a lot of voices on the left, the people who have a lot of life experiences and insights that are beyond my personal scope. But from my limited perspective, what I feel like is really important is that folks don't despair. That I know that it was frustrating the way that this campaign ramped down. I know that it presented a sense of hope that kind of dragged a lot of us out of the cynicism that we have been living with our entire lives. And it's difficult to know what to do with that. And I don't want us to go back into that cynical place, because it was that hope, that belief that a better world was possible, that enabled us to get this far. And for all of the legitimate critiques of the Bernie Sanders campaign, I think the proximate cause of us losing was not actually anything that he did. If I could be a lawyer for a second.
I was going to say, my lawyer alarm went off. Proximate cause.
I sincerely apologize.
Disgraceful.
But, truly, you know, but for the corporate consolidation, right, in the 11th inning.
Yes.
The 9th inning, whatever. You know, but for, as it has now been reported, Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama calling all of the other candidates and asking them to drop out of the race, including Pete Buttigieg, who was frankly doing better than Joe Biden at the time, and asking them to drop out and endorse Joe Biden, enabled a consolidation that completely changed the prospective electoral map, right? So at the end of the day, the question becomes, how do you prevent the centrist, corporatist, core of the Democratic Party from pulling those kinds of moves again. And when I looked at historical examples of what's kept, what kind of movements have been successful, it's, awkward to say, but I look to movements like the Tea Party movement, and I see how by holding individual Congress members accountable in the ballot box, they were able to change the contours of the Republican Party for the worse. Mm-hmm. But they were able to change it to be more radical in the direction that they wanted it to do. And I think that, people talk about down ballot races. We all kind of have this chant. It's not just about the presidency. Bernie Sanders said that all the time, and it's true. I also think that we need to be a lot more vocal and a lot more critical of those members of the Democratic establishment who enabled this to happen. I think that Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, especially those of whom who are still elected officials, Elizabeth Warren, need to be asked repeatedly about why they chose the way that they did and what
about Barack Obama. There's just this article about his intervention.
Absolutely, Barack Obama. And I think that there's a whole other conversation to be had about how there is an inability to talk honestly about Black politicians in this country because of the way the establishment weaponizes identity to claim that any critique of these people is in fact race-based and racist. And I think a lot of why I've drawn a considerable amount of ire from that class of commentary is because I am a Black woman, and it is more difficult for them to say that I'm speaking out of some place of privilege, although obviously I have economic privilege, but that I'm speaking because I just don't care about people of color. I just don't care about women, or Roe v. Wade getting overturned just won't affect me. And, these kind of very simplistic arguments that ignore the fact that Bernie Sanders' base was the most diverse, the most female, the most queer, the most working class in the race, and that Black voters, Black donors gave more to Bernie Sanders than any other candidate in the race and in political history. So, I think that we need to have a conversation among the Black left, and additionally about how we can bring credibility to some of the arguments on the left while also being honest about the left's failings and talking about race, so that we can hold some of the older politicians accountable, so that we can speak critically of Barack Obama and his choices and what they're doing to his own legacy, which I think a lot of us feel very protective of. And those are going to be hard conversations, but there is a lot of work that's going to have to be done for us to be able to adjust the public understanding of how politics works, why things happen, what the power structures are, so that when we move into this moment again, we aren't so easily fooled by pretty superficial media narratives. And it's also really important for everyone to continue to support independent media, and make an effort to grow it so that there is a genuine counterbalance to the misinformation that's coming out of the mainstream television.
Yeah, you wrote that fantastic article for us a couple of years ago, how identity became a weapon against the left. And I feel like it's a perennially relevant piece that you have now seen unfold. All the parts of your thesis in that have kind of now literally happened to you over the course.
Yes. And, it might be something that I end up writing about. To all the people who are very excited about me being unemployed, I have a lot of time to sit down and write my thoughts into a book. Publishers, hit me up.
Well, thank you so much, Bri, for talking to me. It's lovely to have you back at Current Affairs. We're so thrilled. Congratulations to, I think, the best press secretary of the 2020 campaign. By far, you've got a lot of fans out there. We see them. As soon as we announce you're coming back to Current Affairs, we got people subscribing left and right. So for all the haters out there, there are tons of people who truly appreciate all of the work you did for Bernie and running what I think is one of the most, probably the most exciting political campaign of my lifetime, and probably yours, and that succeeded in many, many, many ways. At the very least, in changing the conversation and in getting a lot of people excited about left ideas and to understand left ideas. And we are objectively in a better place right now politically than we have been in a long time.
And I want to thank you, Nathan. I want to thank the Current Affairs family. And I want to thank all of those people online that you've referenced and people who aren't online who have offered their support and who are there having my back. Honestly, people ask me, isn't Twitter crazy? Isn't it very unpleasant for you? And most of the time it isn't that bad because I feel like very much a part of a community. of like-minded people in the way that I didn't feel when I was at a more conservative law firm and when I didn't feel in my former life. And ultimately, I'm very grateful to have had this experience and to have been able to get to know everyone that I got to know over the course of this campaign. And that's why we do this, and that's why we persevere in these tough moments. And I'm excited to keep going forward down this path with you all.
And of course, people should check out the archives now of Hear the Burn, because as part of trying to counter the mainstream media, you put together, really, I would say probably the first ever listenable podcast by a political candidate. I don't think anyone's ever wanted to listen.
About Big Newtons? Talking Big Newtons with
I don't think
Gretchen
anyone's
Whitmer.
ever gone like, I really want to listen to the candidate podcast. But Hear the Burn is great. I was on it. Tons of incredible. You really got a broad spectrum of incredible people, and those interviews are all up on YouTube, and people should go listen to them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Nathan.
All right. Thanks, Brie.